Now here is an interesting thing that you've already seen part of this. This is a sarcophagus early in the Christian era in Rome. The reason I'm showing you this is that it's kind of interesting because now you get to see something you saw earlier out of context. And I'll draw this here from this sarcophagus, and you might begin to recognize it. This you've seen earlier in an earlier illustration was Jesus, and I mentioned I thought he looked a bit like Thomas Jefferson here, and two apostles, and his feet resting on Atlas holding up the world. So a mixture of Christian and earlier mythological or pagan types of representations on this sarcophagus. And you can actually see this in Rome, in St. Peter's. But notice all these many scenes. These are all different scenes, intricately carved out, scenes from the Bible to decorate the sarcophagus of a Christian who had died, a rather wealthy Christian who could afford to have this sort of thing created. This business of combining many scenes in the same work of art, we're going to see also as one of the tenets of the late Gothic era. We'll see an example or two of that sort of thing where artistry of a refined variety is combined with the presentation of many scenes all in one place. And this, of course, is the illustration that you saw earlier. Now, here is a Psalter manuscript. This is another book that would have been used in a church service, and this was a rather tiny illustration that's been expanded here for you to see. The purpose of this was not to be realistic, but once again to tell the story. And symmetry played a big role in it. These heads are properly spaced around this way. By the way, this hat is what Jews of that era, around the 1200s, would actually wear. And of course, Jesus was a Jew, and the attendants around him were Jewish. In fact, the only non-Jewish writer of the New Testament was Luke. In this instance, what we're seeing here is a rather stock illustration that had to include the right figures in order to illustrate this scene, the entombment of Christ. This is late in the Gothic era already. We're going to see rather quickly after this a change in the way that scenes like this are depicted. And that's the reason that this is in this chapter. Now, we're also going to take a look at another development that's as we're approaching 1400 and the beginning of the Renaissance. What we're going to focus on is this type of an illustration here. This is a very standard illustration. It hangs above the altar in a side chapel in a cathedral, and it's the Virgin Mary and Jesus. Let's take a closer look at that. The pose here, the head cocked at this angle, Jesus represented as a little adult, and this hand, it's all from what Gombrich calls a pattern book, that when a commission was received to paint this kind of a painting, the person creating it would look in this standard pattern book and see, well, what is the standard way that we represent this person and Jesus and the angles and the hands? And then they would create the piece of art that way, because that's what the person who commissioned the art expected. They didn't expect some fresh interpretation. They expected something that looked like what they had seen before. Tradition playing a very big role in this. Now, this is another illustration. It's the same sort of a pose. The hands in the same position, the very elegant long fingers. And here's another one, very similar. Background's a little bit different here, but you get the drift. These were all painted from the same notion, the same sort of a pattern book, because that was what was expected. And here yet again, another one, slight variation, the head in the same angle, the Jesus here looking at you, and the hands a little bit different, but basically following the very same lines. So here we have the standard altar depiction of Mary and Jesus. And put side by side, you see the similarity between these from a pattern book. Different coloration and slightly different faces, but basically the same picture. Now here's another one, also in the cathedral in Siena. Something a little bit different about this. I wonder if you can tell me what it is. Let's go back to look at the other ones. And here's this one. Well, interestingly enough, there's more people in it. What's going on here? What's with these other faces? At about this time, various developments in artistry were occurring, one of which was people would donate money to have this sort of artwork created. And sometimes it was nice for them to have likenesses of some people they knew combined with the holy figure. So these might be the children of the donor, maybe pictured somewhat realistically, so that forever it would seem they're here juxtaposed with this holy figure hanging in a church. And it gave people a nice feeling with the vicissitudes of life that you had this degree of closeness with this representation of a holy person. Now here's another departure from the standard pattern books, and the reason I'm showing you this is it sort of leads over to what we're going to start talking about in terms of perspective in the Renaissance. What's different about this from these earlier altar paintings? Here we see a background that has some people in it. Here we see a background that has scenery. This is really different. Now it's making it look like here's the Virgin Mary and Jesus, and they're someplace. They're not just hanging in space with a plain background, but there's actually a someplace back there. And even more, there's an attempt here to use a type of perspective we haven't yet talked about called atmospheric perspective. Notice this hill here, sort of brownish, maybe some vegetation on it, little green here. This is another hill of the very same type, but look at what's the coloration on it? It's fading off to a blue. At this point, it was becoming known that if you looked at scenery in the distance, the effect of the light traveling through air was to accentuate the blue. It's the scattering of certain wavelengths of light by the particles in the air that causes this to happen. That's why, in fact, the sky looks blue. It's made up of a colorless gas, but here on Earth we look up and we see a blue sky. Well, the same thing happens here, and this is one of 5 types of perspective. It's a cue for you seeing this. Psychologically, it sets you up to say, oh, that does look like it looks in real life. And so this makes the painting have some depth. The psychological cue there that there is some depth. If this were painted the same color as this hill, you wouldn't have that cue. It would look much more flat. So be thinking about this. Creeping into artistry at this time is an understanding of how to make things look realistic. And this is a major development of the Renaissance. There are actually 5 types of perspective. This is one of them. You've got an extra credit assignment this time that talks about linear perspective in Chapter 4 in the workbook. That's what people normally think about when they think about perspective, but there are 4 types beyond linear perspective, and here atmospheric perspective is one of them. Now this is just a comparison showing you the earlier renditions of the altar painting, and here this, what we would say, more modern one. It's from a very similar era, but it represents a whole different direction that art was taking.